In the autumn of 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had achieved what seemed impossible just months before. Paris was liberated. Brussels fell without a fight. The German army, so fearsome and seemingly invincible in the early years of the war, was in headlong retreat toward the Rhine. And on September 4th, British armored divisions rolled into Antwerp, Belgium's largest port, capturing it almost entirely intact. The docks were undamaged, the cranes still stood, and the warehouses remained usable. It was a prize beyond measure, a logistical godsend that could sustain the Allied armies as they pushed toward Germany itself. But there was a problem, a critical, deadly problem that would cost thousands of lives to solve. Antwerp sits nearly 50 miles inland from the North Sea, connected to open water by the Scheldt estuary, a wide, winding waterway that snakes through the Low Countries before reaching the coast. And while the Allies held Antwerp, they did not control the Scheldt. German forces still occupied both banks of the estuary, their guns trained on the waters below, their fortifications bristling with troops determined to deny the Allies use of Europe's second-largest port. Until the Scheldt was cleared, not a single supply ship could reach Antwerp. The great port was useless, a trophy that could not be claimed. The failure to recognize this immediately would prove costly. In the euphoria of the rapid advance, Allied commanders, particularly British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, initially focused on Operation Market Garden, the ambitious but ultimately doomed attempt to seize bridges across the Rhine and outflank German defenses. While paratroopers fought and died at Arnhem, the Germans reinforced their positions along the Scheldt. By the time Allied leadership turned its full attention to opening Antwerp, the enemy had transformed the estuary into a fortress. The task of clearing the Scheldt would fall primarily to the 1st Canadian Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. It was a multinational force that included not just Canadians, but also British, Polish, Belgian, and other Allied units. They faced a brutal campaign across some of the most difficult terrain imaginable: flooded polders, narrow causeways, muddy fields, and fortified islands. The Germans, commanded by General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, were ordered to hold at all costs. Hitler himself had declared the Scheldt fortresses must be defended to the last man and the last bullet. The battle would unfold across multiple phases and multiple fronts, each presenting its own unique horrors. The first objective was the Breskens Pocket, a German-held area south of the Scheldt, in what is now the Netherlands. Here, the 64th Infantry Division, battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, had dug in behind flooded fields and a network of canals. The landscape itself was a weapon. The Germans had deliberately opened dikes and flooded the polders, creating a waterlogged wasteland where tanks could not operate, and infantry had to advance in single file along narrow roads and dikes that offered no cover. Every approach was a killing ground, covered by German machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The Canadian 3rd Division launched Operation Switchback on October 6th. Amphibious vehicles brought troops across the Brachmann Inlet under heavy fire. The soldiers who made it ashore found themselves wading through waist-deep water, struggling through mud that sucked at their boots, all while German bullets whipped the air around them. Progress was measured in yards, paid for in lives. Bunkers had to be cleared one by one with grenades and flamethrowers. Snipers picked off officers and radio operators. The constant rain and cold added to the misery, turning foxholes into pools of icy water. For 3 weeks, the fighting in the Breskens Pocket ground on. Villages like Eisendyke and Oostburg became battlegrounds where every building was contested. The Canadians developed tactics for this new kind of warfare, using wasps, flamethrower-equipped carriers, to clear bunkers, coordinating closely with artillery to suppress German positions before each advance, and relying on the courage of infantry who had to cross open ground, knowing they were silhouetted against the sky. Simultaneously, to the north, another Canadian division was fighting toward the causeway that connected the South Beveland Peninsula to the mainland. This narrow stretch of road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, was the only land approach to Walcheren Island, the key to the entire estuary. German guns covered every inch of it. The first attempts to cross were slaughtered. Bodies piled up on the causeway as successive waves of troops tried and failed to break through. The Canadians tried to outflank the position by landing troops behind German lines, but the flooded terrain limited their options. Every attack was costly. Every gain was temporary until it could be reinforced. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew they were trapped, but had been ordered to fight on regardless. By the end of October, after weeks of brutal combat, the Breskens pocket was finally cleared, and the causeway to South Beveland was forced. But the hardest fighting still lay ahead. Walcheren Island stood as the ultimate obstacle. Shaped roughly like a saucer, with a ring of high ground around a low-lying interior, Walcheren had been transformed into a fortress. Massive concrete bunkers housed naval guns that could sink any ship attempting to pass through the Scheldt. Thousands of German troops, including elite units, manned defensive positions across the island. The civilian population had largely been evacuated, and the Germans had flooded the interior by breaching the sea dikes, creating an inland lake that isolated the coastal defenses and made conventional assault nearly impossible. The Allies devised a complex 3-pronged attack. The Royal Air Force would bomb the remaining sea dikes to expand the flooding and isolate German positions. British commandos would assault Westkapelle, the westernmost point, in an amphibious operation. Canadian forces would attack across the causeway from the east, and another commando force would land at Flushing on the southern coast to attack from that direction. The bombing of the dikes was controversial. Expanding the floods would further devastate Dutch farmland and homes, but military necessity prevailed. On October 3rd, and again on later dates, heavy bombers struck the dikes at Westkapelle and Vlissingen. The sea roared through the breaches, and much of Walcheren's interior vanished beneath salt water. November 1st brought the amphibious assault at Westkapelle. Commandos of 4 Commando and 48 Royal Marine Commando embarked in landing craft, supported by specially modified landing craft, equipped with guns to provide fire support. As they approached the beach, they came under withering fire from the massive concrete casemates that dominated the coastline. These fortifications, part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, were nearly impervious to naval gunfire. The support vessels moved in close, trading shots with the German batteries in what amounted to a point-blank naval duel. Several landing craft were hit and sunk. Men drowned in the cold North Sea waters, weighed down by equipment. Those who made it to the beach had to cross open sand, while machine guns raked them from pillboxes. The carnage was horrific, but the commandos were elite troops, trained for exactly this kind of impossible mission. They fought their way off the beach, used explosives to breach the fortifications, and in vicious close quarters, combat began clearing the bunkers. Flamethrowers burned out German positions. Grenades were stuffed through firing slits. The fighting was primal and merciless. At Flushing, another commando force fought house to house through the ruined town. German defenders turned every building into a strong point. Progress was measured in buildings, then in rooms. The commandos would clear one street only to take fire from another. The civilian population, those who had remained, huddled in cellars while the battle raged overhead. Meanwhile, the Canadians launched yet another attempt to force the causeway. This time, with German attention divided and their position on Walcheren becoming untenable, the attack succeeded. Troops poured across, though the cost had been enormous. The causeway would be remembered as one of the bloodiest stretches of ground in the entire campaign. The fighting on Walcheren continued for a week. Every bunker, every gun position, every fortified village had to be taken. The flooding actually helped in some ways, as it isolated German positions and prevented them from reinforcing each other. But it also meant the Allies had to fight in small, separated actions rather than sweeping advances. Amphibious vehicles and boats were used extensively, turning the battle into a strange combination of land and naval warfare. By November 8th, Walcheren was finally secured. The guns that had commanded the Scheldt were silent, but the waterway itself was not yet safe. The Germans had sown the estuary with mines, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Minesweepers had to painstakingly clear a channel before merchant ships could pass. It was tedious, dangerous work. One wrong move, one missed mine, and a ship would be blown apart. The first convoy finally reached Antwerp on November 28th, nearly 3 months after the city itself had been captured. The delay had forced Allied armies to rely on supplies, trucked hundreds of miles from beaches in Normandy, a logistical nightmare that contributed to fuel and ammunition shortages that hampered operations. Some historians argue that the delay in opening Antwerp prolonged the war by months. The cost of the Battle of the Scheldt was staggering. The 1st Canadian Army suffered over 12,700 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. British forces lost nearly 8,000. The 52nd Lowland Division, the Royal Marine Commandos, and Polish units all paid heavily. German casualties were even higher, with estimates suggesting over 12,000 killed and wounded, and another 41,000 captured when their positions finally collapsed. The fighting had been some of the most difficult of the entire Northwest European campaign. The conditions, the terrain, the weather, and the determined German resistance combined to create a nightmare for the attacking forces. Soldiers fought in cold, knee-deep water. They slept in flooded foxholes. They attacked across open ground with no cover. They cleared bunkers at point-blank range. The psychological toll was immense, with many units suffering from combat exhaustion. For the Canadian Army, the Battle of the Scheldt represented both a triumph and a trauma. They had accomplished a mission of vital strategic importance, but the cost had been almost unbearable. The battle receives less attention in popular histories than operations like D-Day or Market Garden, but its importance was arguably greater. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance toward Germany would have been impossible to sustain. The Dutch civilian population suffered enormously as well. The flooding destroyed farmland that would take years to reclaim. Homes were demolished. Thousands of Dutch citizens had been evacuated, many losing everything they owned. The town of Westkapelle was almost completely destroyed. The dike breaches that aided the Allied assault meant that Dutch communities lived with the consequences for years afterward. The battle also revealed critical lessons about the importance of logistics in modern warfare. The failure to immediately recognize that capturing Antwerp was not enough, that the Scheldt had to be cleared as well, was a strategic error that cost lives and time. Montgomery's focus on Market Garden, while the Germans reinforced the Scheldt, has been criticized extensively by military historians. The British commander's desire for a bold, war-winning stroke blinded him to the more prosaic but essential task of securing supply lines. For the Germans, the Battle of the Scheldt was a defensive success that ultimately achieved nothing. They delayed the opening of Antwerp by weeks, but they could not prevent it. The forces committed to defending the Scheldt were lost, trapped with their backs to the sea, unable to retreat. For Hitler, it was another example of his disastrous policy of no retreat, which squandered German manpower in hopeless defensive battles rather than conducting fighting withdrawals that might have preserved forces for future battles. The fortifications on Walcheren, those massive concrete bunkers that had caused such carnage, stand to this day. Some have been converted into museums, monuments to the men who fought and died there. Visitors can walk through the casemates, see the gun emplacements, and look out over the beaches where the commandos landed under fire. The scale of the fortifications is impressive even now, and it becomes clear why the battle was so difficult. In Canadian military history, the Battle of the Scheldt holds a revered place. It demonstrated the capability of Canadian forces to conduct complex, large-scale operations. The 1st Canadian Army, fighting largely independently of American or British command in this battle, proved itself as a formidable fighting force. The soldiers who served there earned numerous decorations, including Victoria Crosses, for acts of extraordinary valor. The battle also highlighted the multinational character of the Allied effort. Canadians, British, Poles, Belgians, and others fought side by side. The diversity of the Allied forces was both a strength and a challenge, requiring coordination across different languages, cultures, and military traditions. But they succeeded, united by a common purpose. In the larger narrative of World War II, the Battle of the Scheldt represents the grim reality behind the triumphant story of Allied victory. The war did not end with the liberation of Paris or the crossing of the Seine. Between the euphoria of the breakout from Normandy and the final victory in May 1945 lay months of hard, costly fighting. The Scheldt was one of many battles that ground down both sides, a test of endurance and will as much as tactical skill. The November weather added another layer of misery. Rain fell constantly, turning roads to mud and fields to swamps. The cold was penetrating, and dry clothes were a luxury. Trench foot became a serious problem, disabling soldiers who had survived bullets and shells. Hot food was rare. Sleep was snatched in brief intervals. The stress of combat, maintained over weeks, broke men who had endured years of war. Yet through all of this, the Allied soldiers persevered. The infantrymen who advanced across the polders, the commandos who stormed the beaches, the engineers who cleared mines, the medics who treated wounded under fire, all of them understood what was at stake. Antwerp had to be opened, the war had to be won, and they were willing to pay the price. When the first convoy finally docked in Antwerp, it was an anticlimax for most of the soldiers who had fought to make it possible. Many were in hospitals, recovering from wounds. Others had already moved on to new battles. Some would never know that their sacrifice had succeeded. But the merchant ships that began flowing into Antwerp, carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and all the supplies of modern war, were the tangible result of their efforts. In the months that followed, Antwerp became the main supply hub for Allied forces. The port handled millions of tons of cargo, sustaining the armies as they pushed into Germany. The Ruhr was encircled, the Rhine was crossed, and German resistance finally collapsed. None of it would have been possible without the blood spilled in the mud and water of the Scheldt. Today, the Battle of the Scheldt is commemorated in memorials across Belgium and the Netherlands. In Breskens, in Terneuzen, in Vlissingen, and on Walcheren, plaques and monuments mark where the fighting was fiercest. Canadian flags fly alongside Dutch ones in ceremonies held each year to remember the liberation. For the Dutch, the Canadians who fought there are remembered with particular affection, liberators who paid dearly to free them from occupation. The battle reminds us that victory in war is rarely clean or simple. It comes at terrible cost, paid by soldiers who face unimaginable dangers because duty demands it. The men who fought in the Scheldt were not fighting for glory. They were cold, wet, frightened, and exhausted. They fought because their comrades were beside them, because orders required it, and because they believed in the cause. The strategic importance of the Battle of the Scheldt cannot be overstated. It was the key that unlocked the final phase of the war in Europe. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance would have stalled, perhaps for months, perhaps longer. The delay in opening the port as it was may have prolonged the war into 1946. If the Allies had failed to clear the Scheldt at all, the entire strategic situation would have been transformed. This makes the initial neglect of the Scheldt all the more frustrating. The opportunity existed in early September to clear the estuary quickly before the Germans could fully fortify it. Instead, resources were diverted to Market Garden, and by the time the Scheldt received proper attention, it had become a fortress. The soldiers paid for that strategic error with their lives, but they succeeded. Despite the terrible cost, despite the conditions, despite everything, they cleared the Scheldt. The port of Antwerp was opened. The supply lines were secured. The war continued toward its conclusion. In the grand sweep of history, the Battle of the Scheldt was a necessary, brutal chapter in the story of Allied victory, a reminder that freedom is never free, and that the price of defeating tyranny is measured in the lives of those brave enough to fight for it.